Let's watch this. You guys know I'm a big UBI guy, so let's watch Ben Shapiro's issue with UBI. This is from like a year and a half ago, but
If you are in that community,
Ben is relatively consistent with his poo-poos, his pee-pees. I don't know why this shit's been so fucking low lately.
good fucking luck getting out.
Right.
Good luck. The money that you get other than welfare is from selling pills. You know, everybody's on these pills, so you're all whacked out. You don't know what the fuck is going on half the day. You're on opiates. I mean, it is a bananas environment. And there's a lot of people like that in this country.
For sure.
In poor Latino communities, in poor white communities, in poor black communities. The idea that these people are just going to pull themselves up by their bootstraps is crazy. I just think they don't have a plan. And I think if we really want to help them, there's got to be some way where you can give these people the opportunity to step out of that pattern. Whatever that community centers, outreach programs, whatever it is. I don't know what it is.
I mean, the truth is that historically speaking, it was people actually going to church.
Yes.
I mean, and there's
a lot of good. I'm not a church-going person,
right.
But I absolutely recognize that there's a lot of good involved in having that framework.
Right, and that I'm not sure that's. I don't think you can create sort of a fake social fabric with just a government welfare system. Like it hasn't worked. I mean, disability exists. It's been increasing every year. It's not. It's a question I asked Andrew Yang actually. So our episode comes out on Sunday, and obviously Andrew is a big fan of UBI, Universal Basic Income. And I'm not averse to the idea of UBI in a future where legitimately 50% of the population can't work because they've all been automated out of existence and all of this.
It's interesting claim. I know conservatives often talk about, religion being as like a focal point and like a big like proponent in moving us forward. And oftentimes the subtext there is, well, people are no longer religious and they're turning away from the moral fabric of society. But I think that the bigger issue with religion is that religion is turning away from people. You know, religion, in all its glory, tends to be very outdated in its ideas. It seems to ostracize LGBT members, as well as to some extent. It actually promotes the power dynamic of men to women. If you really read through it, it's not exactly the most welcoming book. I understand the idea that you should just still believe it'll work, but like it turns people away. And then if you live in a community and you're a straight person, for instance, and you read the Bible and you have churches out not even 10 years ago this was happening. It still is to an extent. You have churches that are like, oh, we don't like gay people. And then like you have a friend that happens to be gay and you're like, well, that's weird because my gay friend is fine. All of a sudden people start turning away from the church. I think that the problem more than anything else is like the church's inability to, I guess, adjust to modern times. And I know what you're going to say. It's like, well, it's the book. It's the religion. It doesn't adjust. And it's like, well, maybe the religion itself has inaccuracies when it comes to the way that it treats different people. So I'm just saying.
But there's one section in his book where Andrew talks about how if we cut people a check for UBI, then they will spend their extra time creating art and engaging in hobbies that they like.
They might,
and I just thought to myself, I said it to him, like, people are on disability. That ain't what they're doing. Right? I mean, if you're on disability, the people you're talking about who are suffering, they're not out there writing poetry. Right? I mean, the rise of the opioid epidemic and people who are ODing on drugs and all this stuff, that's in precisely the same demographic you're talking about. You're just talking about a check from one place as opposed to another place. I don't really.
Well, so like what's interesting here is that Ben Shapiro's taking a very broad talking point from Andrew Yang about how when people have more money, they'll be a little more relaxed and have more time to invest into themselves, which is part of what a human-centric economy is. And then Ben's taken that generalized argument, which I would say is generally true. Somebody who is, we'll say, more normal doesn't necessarily have these types of issues that people on disability may have. Yeah, for sure. They're going to work. They're going to have more time to invest in their hobbies. They're going to be happier. People who may be addicted to drugs, yeah, they may turn more to drugs. But what's very dishonest about Ben Shapiro's argument here is that he's taking a generalized broad talking point from Yang and applying it specifically to people on disability who are also on drugs, and then discounting it based on that. And you have to kind of recognize that language of diminishment where it's just, he's not proposing an honest conversation or an argument.
Really see how that solves the problem. I think we have a crisis of purpose.
Yeah.
And to further expand on people on drugs and universal basic income, people have asked me this question, like, Papa, how does it actually help us stop people on drugs? That doesn't. It doesn't. This is a tough take. It's an unfortunate take. Getting off of drugs is very hard. One of the reasons is because all of our like AA type organizations are very centered around religion. And really they center very heavily around the willpower of God. It's generally impractical. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. And realistically, it's very difficult. Again, it's difficult to get people off of drugs. You could make the claim that people who are on drugs now are kind of, they're going to be on drugs regardless of a UBI or not. However, UBI overall, in a matter of time, will reduce the necessity for people to self-diagnose. I would argue, a lot of mental health problems nowadays, especially self-diagnosed ones, come from like stress. And part of that, I think I'd say a big part of that stress is associated with how much money people have. And so you remove the factor of having to constantly worry about your ability to live, because that's what money is, your ability to live. And I guarantee you that we're going to see a very drastic reduction in people doing drugs, honestly.
Right now?
Overall, long period. Rather, what I mean is people going on drugs in the future. That's my point. People who are on them now may stay on them, but people going forward will be less inclined to turn towards them.
And I don't think that crisis of purpose is solvable on the one hand by changing our trade rules, and I also don't think that crisis of purpose is solvable by cutting a government check. I just don't think that that's how people are wired.
I absolutely agree with you that there is a crisis of purpose. My concern is about automation, and my concern, and obviously I haven't really studied this other than talking to Andrew Yang and talking to Elon Musk and a few other people that are proponents of universal basic income. They think that there's going to be such a massive loss of jobs in such a short period of time from people that are non-skilled laborers, and it's going to go away. There's millions and millions of jobs, and these people are not going to have anything, and then it could be chaos.
Right. So there's two problems that come up there, and
I agree with that. We're already shifting so very dramatically. Like here's where I come from. For people who aren't on board with UBI, this is why I am. This is what got me. These jobs are disappearing, right? We see them. You walk around your everyday life. You can't go to a supermarket without seeing one person running 8 automated fucking self-checkouts. That's a loss of jobs. Factories are just are removing people. That Amazon's closed down like a quarter of the malls in the United States, but even before the coronavirus. That's automation. That's bypassing a step. You see that Uber and Lyft are ravaging, taxis and whatnot, and other professional drivers. You see that even a GPS makes it more attainable for you to be a truck or a bus driver. Like, you guys don't think of it that way, but it reduces, it reduces the skills required in order to exist in those fields, which drives the wages down. So you're seeing this very obvious, commonsensical driving down of wages, as well as displacing of jobs. And here's our option under our current system. We're either going to have to just continuously expand welfare as jobs go away, or we can do something comprehensive like universal basic income that removes the need for all these hyper-specific programs. Right? Instead of cutting a check for this and doing investment in school for this and doing this and that and all these, these different things, all these different programs. Like, I think there's over 100 different programs of welfare type programs. Instead of having those, if we can get those down to a check of $1,000 a month, maybe even more, as time goes on, we've now made it harder for the government to fuck up. The reality is it's either UBI or it's going to be more welfare programs. So I would say that of those two options, UBI is honestly not only the better choice, but it really, to me, is the more conservative choice, because it allows you freedom to use your money on whatever you want, and it gives you freedom of choice.
And this is where Andrew's book is interesting, because problem number one is that the people will be poor. They won't have a source of income.
Yes.
UBI solves that. The other problem...
Sort of, but does it even? It gives them $1,000 a month.
Even if you upped it, right? I mean, even if you just had a Swedish redistribution system and the average tax rate went up to 60% or something, it might, let's say we could solve the money problem for a second, which, without tanking the economy, which is questionable. But let's say we could do that. We could add trillions of dollars to the budget every year, and we could solve that. I'm still not sure that solves the deeper problem, which is that when people lose jobs, they lose purpose.
Yes.
Right. So I'm not sure that UBI solves that problem. As I say, we have a rich social welfare network in the United States, and we're seeing this stuff happen anyway.
See, that's the problem. So now we're talking about purpose, which is a great thing. People do need purpose. I do genuinely believe that. The problem is he's equating UBI to welfare, and he's saying, well, look, people on welfare don't have a purpose, so why would they on UBI? But the thing is people on welfare are not really allowed to work, or they're not allowed to work too much, or else they're going to lose their benefits, which reduces their purpose. It restricts your ability to do anything. Under a universal basic income system, though, you can still work. You could still have a purpose, right? And not only that, but it increases your purpose when it comes to having kids. Right now, like the biggest reason people don't have kids is because of money. Imagine having more money and having a kid. A kid is literal instant purpose. I'm just saying, this whole idea of like purpose disappearing, I would say that UBI expands individuals like purpose. Like think about this, imagine you're just some fucking kid, or you're an adult working at McDonald's for minimum wage and you're struggling to live. Your purpose in life right now is to stress out and like barely survive. Give that person a UBI and they're gonna have less stress, and they're more likely to actually do something like outside of that. Maybe they'll pick up a hobby. They'll have money to do something. You get what I'm saying? Like this is very much all speculative in theory, but I would say that from a common sense perspective, purpose would actually expand if you introduce a UBI, especially if you introduce UBI instead of welfare programs.
I'm a little bit less catastrophic. By a little bit, I mean a fair bit less catastrophic in my thinking about automation than either Andrew Yang or Elon Musk.
Do you think that people will be able to adapt quick enough to avoid the problems? They'll realize the jobs aren't there anymore, and they'll just naturally gravitate towards other professions?
I think over time that people will do that, but they're not always the same people. I mean, there's always shift in the economy, and the ideal economic model has a trucker becoming a coder, right? But that's not reality.
Well, that was that whole learn to code fiasco that got people kicked off of Twitter.
Right, and it
still does apparently.
Apparently, if you say it to journalists, then that's very bad. If you say learn to code to a trucker, that's what it was. That's what it was.
Learn to code to a trucker.
If you say learn to code to a trucker, then that's just you being helpful.
Right.
If you say learn to code to a journalist, then that is targeted harassment on Twitter. That's where that started.
What if someone says it to me?
Well,
how does that work?
Twitter doesn't care about you. I can say whatever I want to you on Twitter. But I mean, I think that.
But if you just say it to a friend, hey, fuckface, learn to code.
I don't know. Is your friend going to report you to the censorship board over at Twitter?
It's such a dumb thing to take people out for. It's one of the best examples of like how censorship oversteps its boundaries and becomes almost like satire.
Yeah, it's really
the idea
absurd.
That, like this is the biggest aggression ever. Learn to code.
Learn to code.
Like that's something like. This is a stupid thing that someone said about coal miners. They literally said that about coal miners, that maybe they can learn to code. And so everybody's like, what the fuck? And so learn to code became a joke and became something that you would mock people.
Right.
Their explanation for it was so crazy. It was like, no, then learn to code got connected with all this white supremacy and all this other stuff.
Well, that's the Hitler owned a dog argument, right?
Exactly.
It's like dogs are bad. Hitler owned one. Okay, white supremacists are bad. They used the phrase learn to code. That means if you say learn to code, you're a white supremacist. Like, what the?
That's how they lost the frog. That fucking frog. The feels good.
Going off a tangent here.
Oh,
there we go.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, as far as automation, there's constantly people saying this is the Nicholas Nassim Taleb view of reality, which is that the Black Swan incident can happen any second, so watch out for it, versus the sort of Steven Pinker view of reality, which is the Black Swan incident is called a Black Swan incident because it's a Black Swan incident, meaning that it happens incredibly rarely. The idea that we are on the verge of a catastrophic drop in job numbers because of the automation of trucking, for example, I'm not sure that I buy it. The reason I don't buy it is because you still are going to need someone sitting behind the wheel of that truck. There are human drivers on the road. There will be a gradual transition away from some of these jobs.
All right, so Shapiro, I get the skepticism about truck driving guys. Like, let's be honest here. Like, truck drivers specifically are not going to be displaced in the way that we think. But I will tell you one thing, okay? So imagine, because here's what I would say, and this will probably happen. This is probably realistic, is that let's say we get the technology to have self-driving trucks. You're going to probably make it a law that makes it so that people who, these trucks that are self-driving will need a pilot. And the reason that is because it's just like an airplane, but taking off and the truck will probably park itself. But the biggest reason is because self-driving vehicles, if they break down in some capacity, maybe some kind of their navigation system breaks down, you're going to want a pilot in there to be able to do something, or a driver in there to be able to take over and like manually drive the car. Self-driving cars are susceptible to hacking. It can really like just create congestion in cities. So you're going to want somebody behind the wheel driving. But there comes another question now, because we're not just talking about the removal of jobs. We're talking about not just the displacement, but also the driving down of wages. if you have a self-driving truck that's going to drive itself almost all the time other than some kind of an emergency, are you going to pay that person the same amount of money? And the answer is no. You're going to pay that person less money because they can basically sit in their fucking cockpit of the vehicle on a Game Boy and just jerk off until some kind of warning system comes on that says, hey, you have to actually drive now. So now we're talking about, I don't know, the average truck driving salary, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's about $50,000 a year, but I think that contextualizes not just like long distance truck driving, but also short distance. But let's say that you decide to drop it down to $40,000. You see what I'm saying? So now they lost $10,000 a year to automation. You understand like my point here?
Andrew Yang talks about radiologists and how radiologists are going to be priced out of the market by computers that can do a better job of diagnosing tumors. First of all, awesome, right? I mean, that's good. First of all, that brings down cost, and
it's true.
You won't get cancer as advanced. So that'd be a good thing. But second of all, what a lot of technology studies have tended to show is that technology just gets integrated in a different way in particular careers. So there will be jobs that are eliminated for sure. There will be jobs we haven't heard of that will be created also. And mostly technology will become more of a productivity aid.
So like this whole argument is always like, I understand what he's saying, but I hate the generalized statement when we talk about technologies displacing jobs where people go, yeah, but it's going to create some jobs too. And it's like, if I eat 5 apples and then someone gives me one more apple, do I ate some apples and now we have more apples. And it's like, okay, but how many more do we have now? The reality of the situation is no capitalist system would ever support investing into technology if it didn't drive down costs. And one of those costs is labor, right? So let's use supermarkets for an example. Let's say you have a supermarket, you have Walmart with like 8 self-checkouts, 4 to 8. Let's say you have 8 self-checkouts. You're going to have one person watching the self-checkout machine, right? You might even have one more person at the door checking people coming through in or out, but that's going to be happening regardless. So count stealing. But anyway, let's get back to what I was saying. So you're going to have one person running 8 self-checkouts. Right? Of course, you're going to need somebody who maintains and manages those self-checkout systems, right? What if they break down? Okay. But it's not going to be one person per store. You're going to have one person probably running either a whole state or a half or a third of the states. You're going to have somebody running like, let's say 20, 50, 100 stores. That's what's going to happen. Okay. That's how they do a lot of technology jobs. Like I used to know somebody. I forget what they worked for, but they would drive around. Like that's what's going to happen. Because if you have one self-checkout breakdown, you call somebody, they're there in a day. Who cares? You know. So yeah, you created one job, but you lost like 500 jobs. You understand what I'm saying? So we need to talk about the proportionality of jobs that are being, replaced. Like, yeah, well, 50 low-wage jobs are gone, and now you have one high-wage job. It's like, great. So now 50 people making $20,000 a year are gone, and you got one guy making $80,000. Like that's, you not only are fewer people working, but there's less money going through the economy now. And it is nice that we have more money. It's cheaper, right, for the consumer. But we need to also make sure that like cheaper for the consumer is good, but like the consumers are people. Right. And so when people lose their jobs, that's bad for the consumers as well. Because, you just lost 500 consumers because they can't work anymore. You understand? And now they're on welfare programs because they can't live. So it's like cheaper for the consumer, except now you have to pay more money in welfare programs. You understand what I'm saying?
To people. So this is true in factories. Jobs have been lost in factories. It's the best example of where jobs are lost, but it's mostly true in offices, right? How many office jobs have been created because you have computers? Would more office jobs
not as
because I
many
write by hand?
Do you think that this is akin to like a government bailout? Like the idea of the government bailout was like the banks are too big to fail. And some people thought, you know what, you got to let them fail so you figure out why they failed and we'll never have it happen again. If there is this thing.
It's so funny with the government, like too big to fail shit, because conservative, like Obama, for instance, the banks failed. And then Obama's like, okay, regulations that don't let banks leverage like 30 times their worth on a risky investment. And then conservatives are like, that's unfair. You shouldn't do that. And then that leads to another market crash once you remove those regulations. And then like we repeat the cycle where like pure, like more heavy capitalism like fucks us. And then like a little bit more, I guess you call it socialism, saves us. And it's like, why don't we just keep the regulation on banks? Would you rather see consistent growth from a bank over the course of like 50 years, or would you rather see a bank crash 5 times over the course of 50 years with huge spikes every once in a while in their prices? And that's the perspective people need to start embracing.
And the government steps in and says, wait a minute, I know you lost all your jobs. We're going to give you $1,000. You don't have to figure it out. $1,000 a month. And some people go, okay, I'm not going to figure it out now. Whereas those people might have gone on a fear-filled journey to try to figure out their purpose in life, because now they're stuck where their job doesn't exist anymore. So they're put in a corner.
Well, those people would have gone on
there's
welfare or
innovation
UBI.
that comes from a welfare check. I mean, there are people who become dependent on government, and they're used to being dependent on government. I mean, that stuff is true.
It does happen.
I mean, and listen, Milton Friedman made an argument for universal basic income as a replacement for the welfare system. There is another problem with universal basic income that I asked Andrew about.
Well, I think
also.
Milton Friedman was actually for, I might be wrong, but he was for a negative income tax.
And that was, one of the big issues is that poor people, very often, people who are permanently impoverished, not people who are temporarily poor, but they tend not to spend money where we think they ought to spend money.
Sure.
They're not taking that money and they're not putting it into education or into.
They might just be buying ho-hos and cigarettes.
Right. I mean, the average person who is making less than, I think it was $16,000 a year, is spending $400 a year on lottery tickets. Right. I mean, that's legitimately just flushing your money down the toilet.
Yeah, no, he's right about that. So, like, that's a lot of people ask me that too. Like, Papa, how do we make sure that people utilize the money the right way? Right. Here's an argument that comes from me, somebody who I've never been like poor, but I've been struggling in debt, right? My fiance has fibromyalgia. It was very difficult for her to work. I was basically running my credit card debt. When you're poor and you can't get out of it, or when you're in a financial sink and you're not going to be able to get more money, you're more inclined to spend your money poorly because you say, who fucking cares? I don't give a fuck. You embrace this idea that you will never be equitable or climb out of the situation that you're in, and it tends to force you to to utilize your money much more poorly. So if you give poor people more money, are they going to spend it like shit? Probably some of them, for sure, right? But first and foremost, that does stimulate the economy, right? But also I would argue that some people will be like, wow, like so I was making $1,500 a month and now I'm making $2,500 a month. Holy shit. Like I don't need to spend $400 a year on lottery tickets anymore, because I don't need that 1 in a million shot at the American dream. I can now save like $500 a month. Holy, like, this is great. I'm not going to spend money on lottery tickets anymore. People don't contextualize the emotions that other people have. It's like, when we have these conversations, we act like we're all machines. It's not true, man. It's really just not true.
Yeah.
So how do you? Aren't you just going to end up back in the same place? In 6 months, where people took that money and used it
I'd
in
say
ways
no.
that actually didn't benefit them. And at a certain point, the question is: do you own your decisions, or do you not own your decisions? And at what level of incompetence or inability do we say you no longer own your decisions, and so we're just going to take care of you on a permanent basis?
So, like, to an effect, we talked about having to go in either UBI or welfare at some point. But, like, again, UBI is like the more, say, I don't know, libertarian option, just in the sense of like more, like, less restrictions and more freedoms and less government control. So I would imagine you would think you'd be all over that shit. If you're using your arguments like, yeah, but what about their inability to act right? Like, you're talking about the personal accountability and responsibility of like other people, and it's like, isn't that what you advocate for? Their personal accountability and responsibility?
Question here.
I think we're looking at when you're talking about welfare, we're looking at worst case scenario, right? Where someone does get dependent upon the welfare state and does use that money frivolously and does make poor decisions. But then there's got to be other people that are single moms that maybe had a kid with some fucking asshole that doesn't want to pay and is a piece of shit, and they have to hide from them, and they're just trying to feed their kids.
Yeah, sure.
Those people exist too.
I would say those people exist more. You have more people that are in an abusive relationship that they can't get out of due to financial constraints that UBI would help, or people who are like single parents who, regardless of which direction you're leaning, that have to work 2 jobs, or even double parents, where they have to both work like one has to work 80 hours a week and the other one works 40 hours a week and then takes care of the kid afterwards. And it's like, how much more positive do you think it would be for the kids if each parent only had to work 1 full-time job? and had more time to spend with them. We're talking about mothers or fathers getting pushed out of the homes. It's like, well, imagine having to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week and not even being able to be around your kid. You know what I'm saying, guys? I mean, that's a huge emotional aspect.
To help them out. Maybe they're not a part of a church, then maybe they don't have a good group of neighbors. Maybe they had to move somewhere for work and they got stuck in some place where they don't know anybody.
Sure. But I think part of this is to recognize that incentives matter on both ends. So the idea is that you give some people more money and they'll do well. It's also true that if you create a welfare system that benefits single motherhood, you will get more single motherhood. I mean,
but that's
single motherhood rate in the black community before welfare.
You see how he's pivoting off the topic. So we're talking about UBI being a net positive for people who could really use that money. And then Ben Shapiro's he tries to reference the idea that a UBI is basically a welfare trap that incentivizes single motherhood when it's $1,000 a month per person. It actually, if anything, would incentivize the more of a nuclear family, because if the dad and the mom are together, that's $2,000 a month. So he's just constantly trying to equate UBI to welfare programs, and it's just not the same. He's just using these common talking points.
There was 20%, now it's 70%. In the white community, it was 5%. Now it's 40%.
Now, you've said that out of wedlock children and having a kid when you're young is it's a terrible idea for your life. But what do you recommend to have kids avoid that? Are you one of those people that thinks
don't put it there without that thing on it?
No condoms, as we're saying.
Right. Don't have unprotected sex. I mean, this is not. It's not. Pardon my fake cursing. It's not effing rocket science. I mean,
you're apologizing for not cursing.
I'm apologizing for not cursing. Yeah, it's not rocket science. This one always bothers me.
Kids make mistakes, and I mean that's what happens. People get pregnant.
And then if the government pays for those mistakes, it becomes less.
So what should happen? Should the kids suffer? So who?
No, I mean,
how should it be? I mean, how should it be worked out?
I mean, it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
You know, if there are parents available to the kid, presumably the grandparents would take a pretty active role in the raising of that kid.
Let's assume they're there.
Well, how about this? How about we assume that if you are old enough to get pregnant, then you are old enough to let's talk about a 17-year-old or 18-year-old. Used to be shotgun marriages were a thing. And really,
you think that's a good idea?
I think the idea of parents staying together for the sake.
It's very interesting if you really break down what he's saying. This is the last point I'm probably going to make. His video is almost over. But he's saying, hey, listen, if you get pregnant, you have to suffer the consequences regardless of what they may be, and it's your personal accountability for what happens. Now, I can actually understand that argument. I am still pro-choice, but I can understand that argument. I think that to a large extent, I'm in support of that argument. But now, before, when he was talking about UBI, he was talking about, what happens if they use the money incorrectly? And it's this kind of idea where it's personal accountability and responsibility can be applied to pregnancy, but why not UBI? It's they might not use the money right, so we shouldn't do it. And it's they might not treat the kid right, so we shouldn't have it. You see what I'm saying? So it's weird. It's basically a form of cognitive dissonance for him to support the idea of personal choice and freedoms when it comes to abortion. But when it comes to a universal basic income, all of a sudden we have to make sure that we limit people and their expenditure of that UBI. So.
Of a kid that they accidentally bore is absolutely a good idea. Yes. Yeah. I think that is a better idea than the man walking away and the kid being without a man in the house for the rest of their childhood.
The parents should figure a way to work it out.
Yes.
And if they were both reasonable, they could do that.
I want to say thank you so much, guys, to all my Patreons, and a special shout out to my Papa XL Patreons. Without all you guys, I would just be some fat dude screaming into a microphone. So thank you so much, guys. Mwah. I love you all. I want Papa Gut to pee on my face, but just as a friend. There's nothing weird about that. I want him to pee on my face.